Hello, everyone, as you're coming in. Thank you for joining us for the Fall into Fair Housing and DEI presentation today. And we're letting everyone slowly funnel in here before we start our program. I see a hand raised here from one of the attendees. That might be an accident, but I want to let you know there will be an opportunity for asking questions after the end of the second presentation. And there is also the chat function that we can use here to start gathering the questions as we go along here. So it looks like all that are coming into the presentation are in now because I've seen the funnel stop. So I'm going to turn it over to my co-host, Lisa Yee, to introduce our first speaker.
Hi, good morning, and welcome to the Fall into Fair Housing Forum. I'm Lisa E., Chair of the Global Business Alliance Committee. Unfortunately, Alexia Smogler is unable to join us today. However, it is my distinct privilege to welcome our first guest speaker today, Khaled Messengal. Khaled Messengal joined NAR's advocacy team on September 1st, 2022, where she serves as a senior policy representative for fair housing. Prior to joining NAR, Khaled was a director of professional development and member engagement at Maryland Realtors. In that role, she served as staff liaison to DEI Advisory Group, the Realtors Institute GRI Advisory Group, the Leadership Academy Advisory Group, the Professional Standards Committee, and the Grievance Committee. She also spent over 10 years serving as a senior attorney in Legal Affairs Department at Maryland Realtors, where she enjoys staffing the statewide forums committee, engaging with members on legal hotlines, training on NAR Code of Ethics, and teaching legal courses. Khaled is a native Washingtonian. She attended Oberlin College in Oberlin, Ohio, and received her Juris Doctorate degree from Washington College of Law at American University. Welcome, Khaled, and thank you for being here today.
Thank you, Lisa. Thank you, everybody, for this opportunity to join you today to talk about fair housing, marketing, and advertisement, and hopefully share some guidance that you will find helpful. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and proceed. So let me put it in slide mode. All right. So can everybody see my slides, hopefully? All right, great. So again, I'm focusing on fair housing, marketing, and compliance and beyond. So I always like to kind of open with some kind of hook or something that kind of gets your attention. So this is a quote from President Lyndon B. Johnson back in April 11th in 1968 as he was signing the Fair Housing Act. And he said, "We've come some of the way, but not near all of it. There is much work to do." So to sort of paint the picture of what was happening before the Fair Housing Act was passed, here's an example of a real estate advertisement out of the Seattle Blue Ridge area advertising a restricted neighborhood, right? And so one of the restrictions had to do with race, restriction number 16, and it said, "No property in said edition shall at any time be sold, conveyed, or rented or leased in whole or in part to any person or persons not of the white or Caucasian race." It went on to say that no person other than a white or Caucasian race shall be permitted to occupy any property in said edition or portion thereof or building thereon, except a domestic servant actually employed by a person of the white or Caucasian race where the latter is an occupant of such a property. So again, an example of the kinds of ads that you might see with the list of the restrictions for that community or that development or that neighborhood. And then we have Mary Rosinski, who is a realtor, and just talking to her about her experiences of what it was like prior to passage of the Fair Housing Act. And this is at a time when they didn't have the digitized multiple listing service. So she was dealing with these books. And so she said every Tuesday and Thursday, she would go and put the listings in the books. And she remembers reading things like no Jews allowed, no Blacks allowed, and seeing various restrictive covenants. And honestly, she says she didn't even think about it because it was just the way things were. So that's her experience. So in addition to the sort of advertising, kinds of advertising that was out there that I just described, there are other policies and practices that were in play, one of which was, this is an example of the Federal Housing Administration Underwriting Manual of the 1930s. And so it says, if a neighborhood is to retain stability, it's necessary that property should continue to be occupied by the same social and racial classes. So you see this whole segregation. And this, again, this is our Federal Housing Administration. Goes on to say a change in social or racial occupancy generally contributes to instability. And then it goes on to talk a little bit about these recorded deed restrictions, which the manual says should strengthen and supplement the zoning ordinances. And one of the prohibitions that's recommended is that the occupancy of properties, that property should be occupied by the race for which they were intended. So again, just trying to paint the picture of the environment at this time. We had in play the 1924 Realtor Code of Ethics, which existed, Article 34 existed for many years after that. A realtor should never be instrumental in introducing into a neighborhood a character of property or occupancy, members of any race or nationality, or any individuals whose presence would clearly be detrimental to property values in that neighborhood. So we had our own code of ethics that was in play, that was we were engaged in these exclusionary practices. So that's sort of the picture of where, a little bit of the picture of where we were. And then I like to include this kind of quote from William Faulkner, which says, "The past is never dead. It's not even past." And so I think it's always important to paint the picture and connect the dots between past practices and policies and actions and how they're still impacting us today. So present day. So we have the lasting impact of these historic actions and policies. We still have a lot of segregation in our neighborhoods and communities across the country. We have disinvestment in many areas and communities of color. And we have huge gaps in wealth and homeownership rates. In our own 2023, actually, snapshot of race and home buying in America, we see that the homeownership rate for Black Americans is at 44% versus what the homeownership rate is for white Americans, which is at around 72%, almost 73%. So we have almost a 30 percentage point gap in the homeownership rate. And these kinds of dynamics stem from our past policies and practices and procedures. So it's relevant and really critical that we understand our history, because it gives us some idea of why we are confronted with some of the issues we are seeing today. The National Fair Housing Alliance is an organization that's located in DC. They have over 600 member organizations, and a lot of what they do is enforce the Fair Housing Act around the country. Each year they put out a trends report. This year, and it really kind of spotlights what's happening in the previous year. So in 2022, 33,000 fair housing complaints were received by them or their various member organizations. My recollection is that the top three kinds of complaints that are highlighted are stem or focus on disability, race, and familial status. So 33,000 fair housing complaints received in 2022. So that's definitely an increase. We still have current day redlining and a continuation of the failure to provide real estate brokerage services and lend to businesses in communities of color. This is an example of some comments that the Federal Housing Finance Agency found in present day appraisals that they actually ended up referring to HUD for investigation in 2021. So a town was described as having Black race population that was above state average. In another report, it was noted that there is more Asian influence of late buying in the market. Another report indicated that the areas, there was a decline in the population, transitioning from being predominantly Eastern European to having substantial Black and Hispanic people moving into the community. And there's also noted in another report that an area was not especially diverse ethnically, with a high percentage of white people. So these are kind of comments that we're still seeing in appraisal reports today. And I'm sure you've seen some of the cases and stories around appraisal bias. You know, there's a big case in California. There's also a huge case or an important case here in Maryland where I worked for many years, sort of detailing the issues around appraisal bias. So that is alive and well an issue that we are confronted with today. NAR's own licensing research findings. So we have in place a research project where we are looking at different fair housing education requirements around the country. And what we found out is that when we look at pre-licensing, when it comes to pre-licensing in fair housing education, we found that more than 20 states don't require fair housing training for brokers at all. And half of states don't require fair housing education for salespeople. And then when you look at continuing education, we saw that only 31% of states require fair housing training for brokers, and only 27% of states require fair housing education for salesperson. So in this sort of, again, continuing education, so after you've gotten your license. So we're working on sort of what we can do, maybe some policies that we can possibly urge states to adopt around this research that we are conducting. So again, just putting this information out there to sort of really kind of paint a vivid picture. So now we jump back into the requirements of the Fair Housing Act when it comes to advertising. So what does it say under Section 804C? It says that it shall be unlawful to make, print, or publish, or cause to be made, printed, or published any statement, any notice, or advertisement with respect to the sale or rental of a dwelling that indicates any preference, limitation, or discrimination based on any of the protected categories under federal law. So that would be race or color or religion or sex or handicap or familial status, as well as national origin. So that is Section 804C. That is the advertising provision of the Federal Fair Housing Act. So talk a little bit about the purpose of the Fair Housing Act in its advertising provision. So the purpose of the advertising provision was to prevent ads and listings suggesting that a home seeker is not welcome because of a protected characteristic. So that is the purpose of Section 804, is to prevent ads and listings suggesting that a home seeker or buyer or tenant is not welcome because of a protected characteristic. Now, keep in mind that the advertising provisions were not intended to protect people from feeling offended, right? So again, it is to root out or prevent ads and listings that tell a home buyer or a tenant that they are not welcome or they are not permitted to be there or should not submit an offer because of a protected characteristic. So the question you might be wondering, how courts decide if an ad violates fair housing law? So the question is, the primary question is, would an ordinary reader find that the ad or marketing piece or whatever it is, do they believe that it indicates a preference, limitation, or discrimination? So would an ordinary reader find that the ad indicates a preference, limitation, or discrimination. So who is this ordinary reader, right? So this ordinary reader is neither the most suspicious, nor the most insensitive, nor the most sensitive person in our community or in our society. And they're also a member of a protected class, that at issue, right? So that's sort of kind of who the ordinary reader is. Also just wanted to point out that 1972 and 1995 HUD guidance really emphasized the fact that context matters. And we'll get to that in just a second. We're talking about these words and phrases lists that are out there, right? But context matters. So this is an alert that there is no authoritative word and phrase list. HUD has not prepared any such list. I do know that there are a lot of lists out there, but you do have to be careful when you're looking at them because, as I mentioned, the context really does matter. So you might be looking at a list and you might see some conflicts within that very list. So context matters, and there is no authoritative word or phrase list that's been approved by HUD or created by HUD. So we also just want to talk a little bit about the evolving sensibilities of the ordinary reader. Maybe phrases like exclusive neighborhood might have been used or acceptable in the past. Maybe the phrase master bedroom might have been seen as okay in the past, but we are evolving as a society, and so we are starting to use phrasing that is more inclusive, that sort of speaks to some of the histories of what we've experienced. The other one are symbols, and I just wanted to bring your attention to this fairly new case interpretation. I know we're talking about federal fair housing law, but also keep in mind that we do have under Article 10 sort of our embodiment of fair housing in our own in-era code of ethics. So we've got Article 10 and we've got the various standards of practice, which again embodies the fair housing principles in our own code of ethics. And there is an interesting case interpretation concerning the Confederate flag. So pardon all the text here, but I thought it would be helpful to kind of give an example of sort of these displays of symbols and how it might play out. Now, this is a complaint that was brought to a board or example, because a lot of the case interpretations that you see in the in-era code of ethics manual or on the website where they are housed now are based on actual stories. So what happened here, there's a home buyer who was looking at properties and noticed a listing with a Confederate flag prominently displayed in the property photos. So what does she do? She files an ethics complaint against the listing broker, alleging a violation of Article 10, which again is our fair housing content embodied in our in-era code of ethics, and she says and she supports it with Standard of Practice 10.3. Standard of Practice 10.3 is the advertising component, just as I read you under the Federal Fair Housing Act, Section 804C. We also have Standard of Practice 10.3 under our own in-era code of ethics, and also Standard of Practice 10.5, which is a fairly new standard of practice, which prohibits hate speech and epithets and slurs and things of that nature. So the home buyer files a complaint and argues in her complaint that the Confederate flag is a symbol of racial exclusion and that the listing broker's display of this photo conveyed a preference and discrimination based on race. So the complaint was received by the grievance committee. They reviewed the complaint and they forwarded it on for a hearing. So what did the hearing panel say? Well, let's see. The complainant testified that she felt threatened by the display of the Confederate flag and took it to mean that she wouldn't be welcome in the home or in the neighborhood in which she was contemplating making an offer. What did the listing broker say? The listing broker testified that he should not be held responsible for what is displayed in a client's home and could not offer an explanation for his client's motives in displaying the Confederate flag. So what did the hearing panel conclude? The hearing panel concluded that the listing broker is indeed responsible for the content he displays publicly when engaging in real estate brokerage services. The panel also discussed whether the display of the flag indicated an illegal preference or discrimination. So they used the standard of a reasonable person and what a reasonable person would think the display of the Confederate flag conveyed and whether it conveyed a discriminatory preference. And the hearing panel determined that the listing broker's inclusion, intentional or not, of the photo, including the Confederate flag, could be reasonably construed as indicating a racial preference or illegal discrimination based on a protected class. And so they therefore found that the listing broker had violated Article 10. But again, this is just really kind of illustrative of one, the sort of the changing sensibilities, and then how displays of symbols might lead to a fair housing violation. So with that, let me go on. All right, so even if a phrase doesn't violate fair housing law, think about whether there are other reasons why you may not want it in your ad or listing, right? You may not want it in your ad or listing. And so some rules of thumb to think about are some questions that you may ask. We're a big proponent, or at least I am, and we were at Maryland Realtors, a big proponent of checklist. And in fact, we had an advertising checklist that was created by our commission, real estate commission in Maryland. So checklists are, I think, really, really helpful when it comes to sort of checking your marketing material. But think about questions that you could ask. Does the ad or listing describe the property? Does it describe the ideal buyer, which you would be concerned about? That's the sort of the red caution, red flag. Does it describe or use code words suggesting the demographics of the neighborhood? That would be a red flag. You'd want to take another look at that. Is the language being used? Is it welcoming? Is it inclusive? Is there any kind of implication that one group is preferred over another? That would raise a red flag. We just talked about symbols. Are there any symbols in there that would suggest a preference or discrimination? Is there anything in the ad or the listing that refers to a racial, ethnic, or religious landmark? So questions to think about, questions to ask when you are reviewing or looking at your marketing material to make sure that it is compliant, right? So what do you think about the following phrases? Do they invoke in you, do you believe that they indicate a preference or limitation or discrimination to the ordinary reader? What do you think about ocean view? What do you think about his and hers closets? What do you think about a walk to the synagogue? Or what do you think about excellent schools? So some things to think about, some phrases to think about. And again, the evolving sensibilities of the reader. And we're talking about phrases that indicate a preference, limitation, or discrimination to the ordinary reader. So some basic advertising guidelines, in my mind, and I'm sure in many of your minds, these are all sort of common sense kinds of sort of things to think about in guidance, but you'd be surprised at how many folks don't comply or who produce marketing materials that don't comply with these advertising guidelines. So rules of thumb, focus on the property and the amenities in your listing description and not on who you think an ideal buyer or tenant would be. Avoid making statements that exclude or express a preference on a prohibited basis. Always include the Equal Housing Opportunity slogan, a logo, or statement in your marketing materials. And don't exclude from your marketing campaign families with children, people of certain racial and ethnic backgrounds, and of course, persons with disabilities, etc. Really, don't exclude any categories on a prohibited basis. A couple other points. If you feature human models in your marketing or advertising materials, ensure that the images are inclusive and representative of all communities that need access to housing. And always, always, always give truthful information about the availability, the price and amenities and features of a property. There are lots of cases out there right now where agents or brokers are not being truthful about the availability and price and so forth and features of a property. And of course, you want to broaden and not restrict your market. So again, basic common sense advertising guidelines. I wanted to pivot just a little bit and focus on the almighty and wonderful AI, right? I know a lot of you are using or probably maybe using ChatGPT or Bard or any of the other kind of platforms that make it easier for you to do your job. And so I don't have to tell you about the benefits and the promise of AI in terms of efficiency. You can start a draft, or you can draft the document that you need as part of the transaction. You generate property descriptions. You can help customers with different aspects of the transaction. It's a super low learning curve. So you can log in and start typing just like you were typing or texting to a person. ChatGPT can create images for listings. And of course, they are able to master tone. So you can ask ChatGPT to say something like X and it will do it. But again, I don't have to tell you about the benefits of using AI. But here's what you may not know. There are some risks to using these kinds of platforms. So hidden bias, so data and algorithms, and I'm sure this is probably not a surprise to many of you, are built into chatbots, and they may incorporate prejudice, subtle prejudices of the humans who create them, right? So we all have biases, and sometimes that seeps into the work that we are doing, the work that we produce, and even the data and the algorithms that we're working with. So they can learn, so these algorithms and these chatbots, they can learn to be prejudiced as well. And the great example is a 2018 Amazon stopped using an AI-based recruitment program after discovering that its algorithms skewed against women. So the model that they were using was programmed to vet candidates by observing patterns in resumes submitted by the company over the past 10 years. And most of the candidates in the training set were men. And so as a result, the AI taught itself to prefer male over female candidates. So what happened? Amazon had to stop using that program. There's also the risk of discriminatory placement. So beware of relying on chatbots in deciding where to advertise. So we all know that segregation is perpetuated by deliberately advertising only in certain publications or only in certain outlets. We also know that HUD and courts interpret discriminatory advertising to include selecting media and locations for advertising that deny particular segments of the housing market information about housing opportunities. So that could be an issue. So if you are placing billboard ads in predominantly white neighborhoods and running them in newspaper ads that are predominantly read by a white audience, that could be an issue. So just keep that in mind. Other risks include inaccuracy. ChatGPT, for example, when it creates text, it appears to be accurate, even if it isn't. There could be some copyright issues. There are cases in courts about whether work generated by AI can be copyrighted, right? It also lowers the bar for quality, makes it easy to turn out fake computer-generated content. So those are some of the other risks outside of the fair housing risk. But I would say that the bottom line is, when it comes to AI, if you're using it to write your listings, for example, ChatGPT doesn't know fair housing law. So you must still review it and use the ordinary reader approach when you are looking or when you are reviewing what ChatGPT wrote. So keep in mind that it does not know, fair housing law does not know what the advertising requirements are. And if you are a broker or manager, you might consider establishing a policy around use of AI that clearly explains what's permitted and what isn't, and any safeguards for what is permitted. And with that, that pretty much concludes my presentation. I want to thank you again for the opportunity to share with you some guidance and just talk about some of the hot topics around fair housing advertising and so forth. So thank you for that. And I will stop sharing my screen.
All right. Thank you very much, Colette, for that presentation. We appreciate it. And again, I'm seeing a few questions coming in right now, but we will get to those after our second presenter, and we'll direct those questions to the correct presenter when we get there. So again, hello everyone. My name is Brian Zutel. I'm the chair of the Risk Management Committee of Orange County Realtors, and it's my distinct privilege to welcome our second guest speaker today, Jana Gardner. Now, Jana is senior counsel with the California Association of Realtors. Since joining CAR in 2014, she has advised members through the legal hotline, presented legal update outreaches, and taught classes on disclosures and the residential purchase agreement. Jana also prepares legal resources such as legal Q&As and quick guides, which are wonderful resources that I use frequently. And Jana also co-hosts CAR's Legal Matters podcast. Jana received her bachelor's degree in social science from San Diego State University and her Juris Doctorate from the University of Southern California. Welcome, Jana. Thank you for providing updates on this important topic today.
Thank you so much for having me. Let me go ahead and get my screen going. Switch over here. Okay. All right. So good morning, everyone. Thanks for the opportunity to be here. And today I'm going to be focusing for you on what are the hottest fair housing topics here in California. So what issues are we getting calls about on the legal hotline? What are areas of interest for the Civil Rights Department? And what do we want to make sure that you are aware of as you're going out and doing business? I'm going to talk about a couple of sales related issues that are very important to be aware of, which is the use of buyer interest letters, also called buyer love letters. Going to talk about when and how the sort of pros and cons of using school ratings or crime ratings in your marketing and discussions with clients. And then I'm going to talk about some, very important topics if you do any sort of property management or leasing having to do with Section 8 and source of income discrimination, as well as the eternal hot topic of assistance animals, support animals, and what you need to know about that. So before I get into those topics, just sort of a general overview, and this is going to repeat a little bit of what Colette was talking about in terms of where the fair housing rules come from. Fair housing laws, we obviously have the Federal Fair Housing Act. We have fair housing laws at the federal level, but we also have them obviously here in California. We have the Fair Employment and Housing Act, sometimes called FEHA, as well as local laws that apply as well. These laws are enforced primarily in California by what's called the Civil Rights Department, formerly known as the DFEH. It was the Department of Fair Employment and Housing. So if you're used to that term and now you're like, everyone's saying CRD. CRD is the Civil Rights Department. They just renamed the agency that does enforcement. And the reason why I bring that up is because you may hear it thrown around a lot. It is one of the reasons why fair housing topics are so important, aside from just from a ethical standpoint, but from a risk management standpoint, it is very easy to contact an agency and file a fair housing complaint. And you want to make sure that you are always erring on the extreme side of caution when it comes to these issues to try to avoid that happening to you. Also, like Colette highlighted, real estate specifically has its own fair housing enforcement as well. So the DRE, the Department of Real Estate, there are regulations that the DRE puts out under the California Code of Regulations that prohibit fair housing violations, and the NAR Code of Ethics enforced at the local association by the grievance committee can be a consequence of a fair housing violation as well. So it's a complicated web of laws on all these different levels. For even more information, you can see our form, the Fair Housing and Discrimination Advisory, the FHDA form. You're probably familiar with this. We introduced this into our standard forms library just a couple of years ago. It comes pre-attached to the purchase agreement, to the lease, to the listing agreement. We want to make sure that both you and your clients are aware of the importance of these fair housing laws and what everybody's rights and obligations are under them. A lot of home sellers don't think of themselves necessarily as housing providers. They're just selling their house, but they need to know that fair housing laws do apply to them as well. And of course, to you as a broker or salesperson. And then same thing for buyers and tenants, what rights they have. So a lot of what we're going to be talking about today is covered in this form, is addressed here. It's a great reference for you if you want to take a look at, what are the protected statuses? What are the various laws that apply? What are good practices, risky practices, I strongly recommend referring back to this form. It is a very good resource and definitely something you want to be highlighting for your clients to look at to help them understand this complicated issue as well. All right, so preamble over, let's start talking about our first hot topic, which is the use of buyer, what we call interest or sometimes buyer love letters. I'm sure you're all familiar with these. So these are personal letters that a buyer sometimes includes with their offer to make it stand out, to bring attention to it. This became it's been around forever. This practice has been around forever, basically. But when the market gets really, really hot, as it did over the past few years, and you have a situation where a buyer knows that they are one of dozens of people submitting an offer on a house, right? They know that, the sellers are expecting 35 offers on this property this weekend. It's understandable that a buyer is thinking, what can I do to make my offer stand out? Obviously, they can write a high-priced, clean offer, but as I'm sure you've all experienced, sometimes even that isn't enough. And so buyers feel compelled to tell the sellers more. Here's why you should sell to me out of all of these people who submitted offers to you. And I think what makes this topic so tricky for people is and why we need to discuss its various risks and issues is people are very well intentioned. For the most part, people are not writing offers thinking, I am going to, induce somebody to violate fair housing law to choose to sell to me. People just want to put their best foot forward. They just want to tell their story and say, hey, here's why I'm the best fit to purchase your home. But the way people do that is where we start to have problems. The content of these letters very, very often, almost always, honestly, includes information that touches on various protected status, which should not be taken into consideration when a seller is considering offers. So you have letters that say things like, the huge backyard will be great for my children to play in, or, the huge kitchen will be great for my large Italian family to cook Sunday night dinner in, or, it's great access to public transit and I have limited mobility, so that's going to be really great for me. There's just all kinds of things that someone is saying genuinely that, not trying to cause any problems, but now all of a sudden they're telling the seller, I have children, familial status. I come from a certain ethnic background, ancestry, I have a disability. There's all kinds of protected status information that gets contained in these letters. Or often people will include a photo. Look at a photo of my beautiful family. Well, now you can see if there are children. Now you can see potentially what somebody's race or ethnicity may be. And this can start to cause problems. Not that the buyer is necessarily doing anything wrong, but now the seller, when they are reading these offers, reading these letters and comparing them, whether they mean to or not, they are internalizing the information in this letter and it could impact their ultimate choice. And obviously there could be sellers out there who engage in overt bias and say, oh, I want to sell to that family because I can tell they're the same religion I am, or I can tell they're the same race I am, and I want to sell to a family like them. That's just, I think, obviously to all of us, a blatant fair housing violation. But what we have to worry about as well is implicit bias, right? There's been a lot of talk about implicit bias. We have implicit bias training that I think all of us go through now that really wants to make people aware that even if you don't think you are expressing a preference for a certain person based on a protected status, you can be. So you could have a seller who reviews these buyer letters and then picks, I don't know why, I just have a good feeling about this offer. I want to accept this one. They may not even realize that they internalized, protected information about that particular offer, and now there's a potential fair housing issue there, because once they accept that offer, someone whose offer was not accepted could say, well, you picked them over me because of XYZ protected status. Or someone who submitted an offer who didn't get accepted, well, you didn't choose me because of XYZ protected information that was in my letter. So there's really, not a lot of pros to this practice and a lot of potential negative consequences. So how do we recommend addressing this? The thing to keep in mind is that a seller does not have to read and review these letters, even if they're submitted with an offer, but sellers have to be consistent. So the important thing to do is, as a listing agent, talk to your sellers ahead of time. Let them know that this practice exists and talk to them about what they would want to do. If they say they want to accept these letters and review them, they have to do it for everybody. They can't pick and choose what they want to read and what they don't. Or our recommended practice, if they say, I'm going to opt out, I don't want to receive or review these letters, that's the practice we recommend. Not required, but definitely recommended. But they have to be consistent about that as well. So it has to be one or the other. We tried to make this a standard part of your listing practice by putting this section, paragraph 10C, into the listing agreement. So hopefully you're familiar with this by now. We added this in the past year or two, but we have this provision here in listing paragraph 10C that lets sellers know, refers back to the Fair Housing Discrimination Advisory, which also talks about this practice and basically says, seller, and this is the default in the agreement, our suggestion is to not review these letters. So the default says seller is instructing the listing broker to not present buyer letters and authorizing them to put comments in the MLS listing remarks that any buyer letters accompanying an offer will be returned and not presented to the seller. So just across the board, full transparency. Please don't bother submitting these letters. If you do submit them, it's going to be returned back to you and the offer will be moved on to the seller without that piece of information. If obviously there's a legal and ethical obligation to present all offers to the seller. So if someone does send a letter, even if you've asked them not to, you can and should tell the seller, by the way, this offer came with a letter, but per our agreement and your written instruction, I am going to return that back to the buyer, and you can review the substance of the offer without that extraneous information. So that is the default, how it works with the listing agreement. Remember, it is ultimately the seller's decision. They get to decide what they want to do. If they do want to opt in and say, no, I do want to read these letters, there is that checkbox there in 10C2, and there is language letting them know they are acting against their broker's advice by doing that. The final note I'll say is that, I have seen examples of these letters that are, that would be considered fine, right? That say, I admire the architecture of the home, things like that. You can write them in a way that's very neutral, but that isn't, in my experience, what people typically do. They want to tug on people's heartstrings. They want to appeal to them personally, and that's where things get a little bit sticky. All right, second hot topic is one that's been coming up a lot lately: the use of school and crime ratings in marketing and even just in conversations with clients as well. So let me say off the top here, there's a couple of different ways of approaching this. There's data, right? Objective data about school quality in the area, or crime statistics, crime data in the area. And there are these so-called ratings, which is where a company, a service gives a score. This school district has a rating score of 7.2, or this neighborhood has a safety score of 6.5. And that's where things can get really tricky, because sometimes these, companies that do these rating systems, that they're not strictly objective, right? They're pulling from objective sources, but then they are analyzing them and processing them and putting out a score number. And that's where sometimes bias can creep in, kind of like Colette was talking about with the use of AI and things like that. Anytime you start plugging things into a computer program, biases can develop, even in what we think of as being, a neutral, everything just goes in the machine and it comes out. But oftentimes we don't really know how those factors are put together. And there is a risk of these ratings and things not being really truly objective. The other issue is that often discussing these issues or advertising these issues can be a proxy for discussion of neighborhood demographics or other types of status, kind of like the examples of, exclusive neighborhood or high quality schools or things like that. Sometimes people use those phrases and they basically mean, it's largely comprised of people of a certain demographic group. And so again, you want to be very cautious. It's, clients do care about this. Clients will ask, how are the schools in this area? What is how safe is this neighborhood? But You want to make sure that you are having these conversations in the right way. You are giving your clients the appropriate resources and giving them the tools to, do their due diligence and satisfy themselves as to these issues. Like I said, you want to make sure you understand anything you do discuss with a client. Where is the data coming from? How is it analyzed? How is it presented? And how is it being used? So why we care so much about this, because the improper use of this data can result in a number of fair housing violations, one of the big ones being steering. So steering is the practice of directing certain clients to or from a various neighborhood based on its demographics. We heard about the example from the past 100 years or so, which stuck around for an unfortunately long period of time, of saying, oh, well, you shouldn't bring someone who's not like the members of the existing community into this community. And we don't see things that blatant really put in writing anymore. But unfortunately, we do still see situations where there's complaints that are filed, cases that happen, where realtors sometimes do fall into the trap of saying, oh, this community would be a good fit for you. Does it mean that it's comprised of people of the same ethnicity, race, religion, things like that? And that can come up with, oh, your child would be a great fit in this school. Well, what is that based upon, right? Also, unequal treatment. Is this information being given to all clients and presented in the same way? So you want to make sure any information you're sharing, you share with all of your clients and you share it in the same manner. And then finally, discriminatory effect. A policy that even seems neutral can have a discriminatory impact just based on, again, how it's used, who you're talking to and when. There's just so many ways you can sort of fall into this trap. So what are the best practices for discussing school quality and crime statistics with your clients? The number one big one is stick to objective sources. So these third-party sort of companies, services that spit out grades and rating numbers, those make me a little bit nervous. There are plenty of objective sources out there. The California Department of Education, you can go and you can get information, statistics about the schools themselves. Same thing with crime safety issues. You can look into that. You can, use the resources available in the community with the police department, sheriff department, other places where information is available, and get hard numbers and not just ratings or scores or grades. Encourage your client to research independently. If this is something that they really care about, you can give them guidance, you can give them the tools, you can make the suggestions for where they can go do their due diligence. But again, in order to make sure that things aren't being filtered unequally through a broker or agent to different clients, always encourage your clients to do their due diligence themselves. And ultimately, consistency is key. The same information you would share with one client, make sure that's the information you would share with other clients as well. You don't want to find a situation where you make assumptions about what people would care about or things like that. That's where people have really gotten in trouble before, is, they just make an assumption. Oh, this client cares about this information, so I'll share it with them. I don't think this client would be worried about that, so I won't. You may just implicitly be making assumptions you're not even aware of. Make sure consistency, whatever your practices are for how you present this information with clients, how you discuss it with them, what direction you point them in, stay consistent. That's the number one thing to do. All right, a couple more things. This is a big one. If you do any property management, any leasing work, Section 8, source of income discrimination, has been one of the biggest issues we've seen in the past few years. It is one of the major sources of complaints against property owners, property managers, everyone in the rental space. So for a very long time, one of the protected statuses in California, protected classes, has been source of income. So established under California Fair Housing law, you cannot discriminate against someone based on their source of income, which traditionally has meant, whether their income comes from, a government source or a particular job or child support or whatever the case may be. Their income is their income, and you can't treat them differently based on where it comes from. Starting in 2020, this law was clarified and frankly a little bit expanded to specify that people receiving a government housing subsidy like Section 8 are explicitly covered specifically protected by this source of income rule. So in other words, as it stands now, any housing provider, property owner, property manager cannot refuse to rent to somebody on the basis of them receiving a housing subsidy, a Section 8 subsidy, anything like that. And this was a pretty major change. It was pretty common in my experience prior to 2020 to see people advertising no Section 8, or if someone called up saying, oh, we don't take Section 8, we don't participate in that program. And people felt comfortable doing that because if you're not familiar with how a program like Section 8 works, yes, the tenant receives a housing subsidy from the government. It gets paid directly to the property owner. That's actually pretty good for consistency and making sure the rent gets paid. But there are other obligations that go along with it. The property owner or the property itself, it has to meet certain qualifications, certain hoops have to be jumped through, paperwork has to be filed. And so before 2020, owners would say, well, I'm going to opt out of that process. No longer allowed. A basically good faith effort has to be made to take part in the Section 8 process, Section 8 program, if a tenant comes to you making that request. So what should you do? How should you respond if this situation comes up? A housing provider should be prepared to participate in the housing authority approval process. So in other words, if someone comes and they say, oh, I would like to rent this property, I get Section 8 subsidies, I would like to apply. They apply, they're approved. Be prepared for working with the Section 8 program and be prepared for the fact that it may take a little bit of time for that process to go through. Now, that might mean it takes a little bit longer to finish the procedure of renting to that tenant. That alone is not a reason to say no. You still basically are supposed to, within a reasonable time period, work it out. The Housing Authority in California has said that they understand the burden this places on property owners, and they are working to expedite the process, move it along quickly so there aren't extended delays, but just be aware of that. Now, you can still charge the same security deposit amount that you would otherwise. That's another big question I get, which is, okay, well, they're paying a reduced portion of the rent. Do I have to reduce the security deposit? No, you can charge the same security deposit within the legal requirements that you're planning to charge somebody else. That is okay. And a housing provider may still screen the tenant the way they would screen any applicant, right? But there are two sort of caveats, exceptions to be aware of. One is if there is an income requirement, if the owner has a policy that says, for example, tenant's income has to equal 3 times the amount of the rent. For a tenant receiving a housing subsidy, part of the Section 8 program, you can only require that their income be 3 times the portion that they pay. So if they only pay 10% of the rent and the government pays the other 90%, you can only require that tenant's income to be 3 times of the 10% portion that they pay, not the full amount. And this is a brand new law, so preview of a new law that's going into effect on January 1st. Again, as I told you, this was a hot topic. We're still getting new rules and regulations around it from time to time. If the tenant applicant is getting a housing subsidy, and they have poor credit, maybe their credit history, their credit score does not meet the owner's or the property manager's minimum requirements, you have to give them a reasonable opportunity to show their ability to pay in some other manner. So basically, maybe they don't have a great credit score or a great credit history, but you have to give them the opportunity to show their, recent paychecks, a bank account, something like that, to show, yeah, I might not have great credit history, but I have enough money to pay, my portion of the rent. And so that has to be allowed to take place. You can't just automatically decline somebody who is a Section 8 tenant applicant based on credit history or credit score either. All right. And then final topic, always an eternal hot topic, so I want to revisit it, which is assistance animals, which is service and what we call emotional support animals under the law. So a lot of people don't always understand that there are 2 different types of assistance animals, that service and support animals are not the same thing. Service animals are dogs. It's always going to be a dog. Technically, it can be a miniature horse, but yet to encounter that situation. So service animals are dogs that are individually trained to do specific work or tasks for a person who has a disability. This can be most commonly, you're going to see a seeing eye dog for a person who is blind, a alert dog for someone who is hearing impaired. Dogs can alert people who are prone to seizures, all kinds of things. They've trained to do incredible things. And so that is what we call a service animal. They've been trained to assist a person, and that can be any kind of dog. Then we have what everyone's familiar with, emotional support animals. Emotional support animals are not trained to perform a specific task. They are functioned to provide emotional support and companionship to the owner, and to help somebody basically live comfortably who suffers from some sort of, could be mental or physical disability, and they need this animal to live comfortably, to provide that support. It can be any animal. It can be any size, type, or breed. So what are the rules if you encounter someone who comes to you and says, I want to rent out this property, I have this service or support animal? Again, apologize, this is a lot of text on the screen, but there's some very important information on there. So the first has to do with service animals, and the rules for the service animals are very clear and very brief. If someone comes and says, I have a service animal, you can ask them two questions. One, are you or the tenant, who's applying, do you have a disability? They say yes. Then you can say, well, what is the task that this dog has been trained to provide? And they can say, it alerts me when I'm about to have a seizure. Great, done. That's the end of the conversation. You can't ask for any documentation. You can't make them do anything else. That's the end of the story. And the reason for that is because under fair housing laws up to the federal level, having a service animal is essentially a civil right. It's important to somebody with a disability to be able to have their service animal. Emotional support animals, the rules are a little bit different, a little bit more complicated. So if someone comes and says, this is my emotional support animal, dog, cat, whatever, well, then you are going to engage in what we call an interactive process with that tenant to get some more information about their need for what we call a reasonable accommodation. So if there's a no animal policy, someone says, I have a support animal, that request is typically considered a reasonable accommodation, and you want to have an interactive process to discuss that with them. So what's the best practices for doing this? Have a written policy for how this situation will always take place, whatever happens, have a written policy. Again, consistency in how you deal with it. Make sure these requests are submitted in writing or confirm them in writing if it's based on a conversation you had. And then the one thing you can do is you can ask for written documentation of the tenant's need for the support animal. Now, typically this will be like a doctor's note, a note from a doctor or a therapist, but keep in mind, it doesn't have to be a doctor's note. So it can be a note from any what's called reliable third party with knowledge of the tenant's disability and their need for this animal based on an individualized assessment. So it could be someone from a support group or a sponsor or something along those lines. It does not necessarily have to be a medical professional, although often it is. And just make sure that you respond to these requests in a timely and respectful manner, keeping everything confidential. The final sort of question I always get is, well, what is reasonable? Somebody shows up and they have their emotional support giraffe, right? Okay, not really a reasonable request for accommodation, but they have their emotional support cat, dog. What if it's a dog that is a sort of quote unquote dangerous breed? You can't reject the request on that basis. If the specific animal has a history of being destructive or dangerous, that's a different story. But breed alone is not going to be enough. What if the owner has allergies? Then you're still going to have, okay, so how can we work around that? Can we do air purifiers? Can we get things cleaned? It's always has to be this interactive process to try to find a way forward, never just saying, sorry, no. You want to make sure you're working towards a way to accommodate this tenant's request. All right. And that was it for my hot topics. And I'll turn it back over and we can get some questions going.
Very good. Thank you, Jana, for your wonderful presentation. And we do have a number of questions here. Let's see. Oh, we just turned off the share there. So we will start with the questions. Lisa, did you have any that you wanted to start with?
Should we go over the audience question first, or?
Yeah, any particular questions that we wanted to start? If not, I've been keeping track of them here, and let me
Right.
grab
Okay.
them and we'll bring them up here. All right.
Okay.
So this will be a question for, I think, for either one of you. And I don't know if you want to answer this or just say that's the policy. But the question is, why is a master bedroom now a flag for fair housing?
Yeah, that's a good question. There is the thinking, as remember I was talking about the evolving standard of the sort of the ordinary reader, and these kinds of phrases that were kind of okay. Master bedroom to some may imply the concept of dominance or ownership, or could be perceived as racist or sexist. So the sort of the evolution of thinking around that phrasing, we now kind of use, instead of master bedroom, primary bedroom, but it sort of relates back to sort of the history of slavery and the concept of the master versus the slave. And again, this concept of dominance and ownership. And so that's kind of why that phrasing is kind of starting to kind of fall out of favor. Do you want to sort of piggyback on that, Jane, if you have any additional comments? But
yeah, that's essentially what the exact same thing I would say as well, which is just, it's all about, the evolution of language and how certain people interpret certain things. And so often we're just going to recommend erring on the side of caution and say, if there is, not that, okay, you've done something inherently wrong by using that word, but if there's a synonym that you can use that's going to be even more neutral, then it's always a good practice.
All right. Next question for perhaps either one of you. Is the phrase executive neighborhood okay to use?
Interesting. I'll let Colette share her thoughts. I mean, I think sort of in the terms of, she gave the example of exclusive neighborhood. I think it's a similar issue. I think you hear executive, what, should you picture a certain type of person? You probably shouldn't,
right.
but I think people do. I think, an executive can be anybody, but what does it imply when you're using that phrase, would be my concern.
Yeah, and even a particular type of person, or even how would my family, is this okay for me and my two kids? So that, I think it speaks to this notion of exclusivity, and what we want to sort of we want to steer kind of clear of that and be more inclusive with our phrasing and language. So that would be my thought on that phrasing.
This next question goes kind of to the measure or the standard that was discussed earlier. And it says, is there a heightened scrutiny depending on the background of the principal? It says, for example, if the principal is a non-agent attorney, would they be expected to be more aware of fair housing laws when they sell or rent their property, even if they don't practice real estate? And then the follow-on question, or do courts apply fair housing laws equally, regardless of the principal's sophistication or professional background?
Oh, I mean, my understanding is, and Colette can share her thoughts as well, these things are really applied based on the person's actions. I don't know that someone's going to be held to a higher standard. It's just, if someone is bringing a claim you did something wrong, I mean, I suppose it can go to something like intent. But I don't think you're going to get cut a break if you have less knowledge, which is why we're trying to educate people from out of making those mistakes.
Yeah, I mean, I think they're the standard, if a attorney who happens to be a seller or buyer is alleging, that they've been treated discriminatorily, they've been discriminated against, then the standard is the standard. The elements have to be proven and all that kind of thing. So, you know, I would kind of agree with what Jenna was saying.
And I think based on one of your slides, Colette, it would be more of a subjective across the board, reasonable person standard rather than objective based upon the background of the person. Is that right?
Yeah, I would say that's about right.
Okay. This question goes to the presentation about the service animals. So Jana, in a community that restricts the size of dog, perhaps by weight, does that apply to a service animal?
Great question. And the answer is no. So even CCNRs, HOAs, they're subject to the same fair housing rules that a property owner is as well. So they are expected to make the same reasonable accommodations. And so if you have an HOA that says no dogs bigger than 25 pounds and someone has a 35-pound support or service animal, the HOA is going to be expected to be flexible and accommodate just like the property owner is.
Related to that, can someone deny an applicant if they have more than one support animal? For instance, 1 dog, 1 cat, 2 dogs, 2 cats, or is there a limit of 1 support animal?
There is not a limit. They can have more than 1. Some people do have more than 1. You know, we can think of extreme examples, right? Someone shows up and they have their 10 support animals. Now we may be outside of the realm of what we would call a reasonable accommodation. They have 2 or 3, and I have seen that. I have seen that, or maybe there are multiple people in the family, and each one of them has their own personal support animal. So yeah, there's no, for better or worse, there's no hard cutoff. Maybe you're going to get to a point where the request is so extreme that it falls outside the bounds of reasonableness. That's decided on a case-by-case basis. But you know, it's not like 1's the cutoff or 2's the cutoff. It's all based on what's reasonable.
And one more question related to that, and we'll go back to Colette for a different question. Jana, is there one of the questions was you had a number 1 and a number 2 point regarding service animals. Sure. And this person only heard your first point, not your second point.
Right. So yeah. So sorry. The 2-part question. There's 2 questions you can ask if someone says they have a service animal, and I want to actually add a caveat to this. So I'm glad they brought this up. 1, you can say, do you or does the tenant have a disability? They say yes. That's question number 1. And then question number 2 is, what task has the animal been trained to provide to assist the person with the disability? And they say they alert me because I'm hearing impaired. That's it. That's the 2 questions. The one note I will add that I meant to mention is you're not supposed to ask those questions at all if it is obvious from interacting with the person what the situation is. So if you can tell the person is visually impaired and they have a seeing eye dog, don't interrogate them. It's clear what the situation is. If it is not immediately obvious from interacting with the tenant applicant, then those 2 questions. Do you have a disability? What task has the animal been trained to provide?
And I'll give a quick plug. I don't know if Jana wrote it here, but there are some really good resources on the CAR website, both a 1-page document and then a pretty lengthy Q&A on service animals and emotional support animals that I refer to frequently. Now to Colette, there was a reference to the phrase code words, and there's a question: how are code words defined?
If I'm thinking about, so code words, is that in my deck code? Did I use code words, or let me see. Oh yeah, describe or use code words suggesting the demographics of the neighborhood. Yeah, so what would be a good example of using a code word instead of point blank talking about the demographics of the neighborhood? Maybe let me give that some thought to give, but it's sort of like hidden phrasing or whatever that doesn't really sort of straight out say, well, this is a mostly Black neighborhood, this is mostly white neighborhood. Maybe you might say something like it's well kept. It might be, I don't know, something along those lines. But just coded words that suggest that you're getting at something else as opposed to asking the question directly. If that makes any sense.
Related to that, there was a question, how do you answer a question, for instance, what is the church next door? Is that okay to answer, or is that a fair housing violation? If somebody asked that.
What is the church next door? We know that, when you have in your marketing material phrasing like close to the Catholic Church or the, Jewish temple, whatever the case, then that could be construed as stating a preference. If somebody directly asks, what is the church next door? In a conversation, and you happen to know, I think you can answer that question factually. I think you can chime in, Jen, if you have any different thoughts on that. I think, but generally, I think the key takeaway when it comes to this questions is to sort of redirect and to be able to share reliable resources about the neighborhood or the community, and even to suggest to a client, you should ride around this neighborhood and get a sense of what it feels like for you. Maybe talk to the neighbors. But in a conversation where you're directly asked a question about the name of a church, I don't know that that's necessarily that you're going down the road of violating fair housing law. What are your thoughts, Jenna?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, if someone just asks you what, a somewhat straightforward question, what is the church next door, and the answer to it, okay, you don't, I think it would be a little bit awkward to be like, I can't discuss that with you. I think you can just answer the question. Now, they start asking more about, what type of people come around here, et cetera, et cetera. There may be a point where you're like, well, drive around, and why don't you get a sense? I think, like I was saying, directing people back in a direction of sort of doing their own due diligence, looking at objective features of the neighborhood is the way to go. But I wouldn't worry about just answering a simple question like that.
Another question, getting back to the support animal and service animal questions. Can you charge a deposit or increased rent for service animals or support animals?
Great question. And the answer is no. Basically, once it's established that it's a service or support animal, so they answer your service animal questions, or they hand you a note from their therapist saying it's a support animal. At that point, it's not a pet. You can't treat it like a pet. It is a reasonable accommodation you are making. So you cannot increase their rent. You cannot charge them a higher security deposit. You cannot basically impose anything on them that you would impose on somebody without an animal. The one thing you can do that I will recommend is we have an animal terms and conditions addendum that you can incorporate into the lease. That used to be called our pet addendum, but we recently updated it. So it's the animal terms and conditions. And so it's now usable even if the animal is not a pet. There's a separate section that only applies to pets, because that is where you can say things like charging this additional fee, et cetera. But, you can still tell them you have to follow all the same. They're still going to be responsible at the end of the term. If they do damage, they're responsible. If, they have to pick up after the animal, they have to make sure it doesn't attack anybody. They have to make, they're responsible if it causes damage. You just can't charge them any upfront fees different from any other tenant.
Along those lines, and I think you answered this question, there was a question, can the support animal be other than a dog or cat?
Yeah, it can be. It can be, it can be really anything that is reasonable to have within a residence. So it could be a rabbit or a gerbil or sort of whatever. As long as it is legal to have as a pet in, the area. I gave my goofy example of a giraffe or something, which it's like a wildcat or things like that. Okay, that's going to be, you can say no, but any animal that's legal for them to keep could be a support animal. Yeah, snakes. If it's legal to have chickens where you are, then chickens. I mean, it's pretty broad.
Wow, the snakes even. You could have
You could have an emotional
rattlesnake.
You got, yeah, if that's what provides you
Yeah.
emotional support, sure.
Interesting. Getting back to the Section 8 question, or Section 8 rent question, if the tenant is willing to pay cash for the rest of Section 8, is this acceptable? Not following the question.
Yeah, I'm not sure exactly what they mean. If they mean like they're going to pay all their portion ahead of time or something like that, you know, one, I will have to give the caveat of you've got to make sure you're following the Section 8 rules. I don't know off the top of my head if Section 8 would allow them to do that. And two, what I'll say is you can't make a Section 8 tenant do something you wouldn't make a regular tenant do. So if you wouldn't make a regular tenant pay you cash in advance, you can't make a Section 8 tenant pay you cash in advance. And my guess is that's probably not even allowed under the Section 8 rules anyway.
And related to the Section 8 question, if you need more information for making a property HUD compliant to accept Section 8 rent, what resources do you suggest?
Oh, sure. I mean, one, HUD has their own Section 8 resources. You can reach out to the local housing authority for more information on that. And then also we do have some Section 8 resources on car.org as well that I can make sure gets included with any resources that are distributed to you guys, or if you just go to our Q&A section and look for Section 8, we have additional resources available there.
Moving to the love letters topic, and a question for either of the presenters. When we tell sellers that they probably should not read the love letters, and they do, if a buyer feels they were discriminated against as a realtor, are we still responsible if action is taken against the seller for rejecting their offer?
I mean, so I can tell you that in our, you know, in our listing agreement, that's why it defaults to saying they're not going to receive the offers. And if they want to opt into it, we tell them they are acting against their broker's advice. Now, practically speaking, if someone feels discriminated against and they want to bring a complaint or a suit, will they name everybody involved? Probably. That's how these things go. But the most you can do to protect yourself ahead of time is just document these conversations in writing, document your advice to your clients in writing, so that if something does go wrong, that's the best defense available to you.
Colette, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, just to reiterate the importance of documenting the conversation. I know just as a caveat, in Maryland, I know we recently revised the listing agreement to where the seller has to essentially acknowledge that they will uphold fair housing laws, and that they will not accept any love letters or any photos or anything like that. And they have to sign that or initial that provision as a risk management tool for sellers and listing agents. But I 100% agree with Jana that documenting the conversation and putting it in the file so that if anything happens, then you can refer back to that written record I think is really critical.
Kind of an intersection between animals and insurance companies here. This question says, some insurance companies won't insure a property where there are certain dog breeds. Can they, I'm assuming that's the renter, perhaps the landlord, refuse to rent to someone with one of those animals?
So great question. This comes up a lot, and especially now with sort of the dicey insurance market. I know people really don't want to rock the boat with their insurance companies. But here's what I'll say. It comes back to having an interactive process and attempting to make reasonable accommodation. So here's what you can't do. You can't, if someone says, here's my emotional support pit bull, you can't say, sorry, no, my insurance doesn't allow it, and just reject them. You can't do that. You can say, okay, thank you for letting me know. You know, I need to talk to my insurance company about this. Let's get this process started. And then do talk to your insurance company. Do see if there's a workaround. See if there's other insurance companies. Like the landlord really is supposed to do everything within their power to make sure to try to make this accommodation. If at the end of the day, they cannot obtain an insurance policy, or they will lose their insurance if this animal's on the premises. And sometimes losing your insurance affects your loan, things like that. The owner ultimately, after a fairly extensive process, may be able to say, I did everything within my power. Unfortunately, I cannot reasonably accommodate this request. But you got to do all of that. You can't just say, sorry, no. You have to try to see if there's any other options available.
Agreed.
Do you have something to add, Colette?
No, just agree that interactive process is critical, and that you absolutely can't just say no. That's exactly what I would have said.
Kind of related to that, but an important question: if there are more than one applicant, can the landlord select the best fit applicant between a Section 8 and a non-Section 8?
So, here's what I'll say. Our recommendation for the tenant screening process is to screen applicants in the order their applications are accepted, and to accept the first applicant who meets the established written criteria that you have for tenant screening. What we don't recommend is gathering a bunch of applications, looking at all of them, and then picking the one you like best out of that group. Because when we start talking about things like best fit, we might be taking things into consideration beyond the objective financial criteria that we can use. And you're not allowed to consider whether or not the person is Section 8. So, and again, even if you or the owner or whoever says, oh no, I just, I didn't consider that, I just picked what looked like the best applicant, it's not there's no law that says you have to just take applications in order and screen them in that order, but it is the best way to protect yourself from a claim that you took into consideration any impermissible criteria when you do it in that orderly fashion.
Okay, and we're going to make this the last question. Returning to the insurance intersection with animals, the question is, with regard to, for instance, the pit bull, can you ask the tenant to pay the difference in the insurance cost?
No. In the same way you can't impose a cost, you can't impose a higher security deposit, you can't charge higher rent. That sometimes making this accommodation might result in a higher cost for the owner, but you are accommodating the tenant's needs and you cannot charge them anything extra for it.
That's right.
All right. Well, thank you again to our two presenters on this topic, these very important topics. Thank you, Colette. Thank you, Jana, for this. And thank you, everyone, for joining us today. On behalf of myself and my co-host, Lisa, I want to thank you.